Forgive me for a second while I navigate this. I'm doing at least three things which are not normal for me. One, I'm going to speak actually having some slides behind me, which is rare. Two, after 5 years of avoiding thinking about suicide by not wearing a tie, I've actually worn one today. And Mark's sort of pitch hasn't made me want to drag it up yet. And the third really is I don't normally walk around like Bigfoot. Forgive me because my natural style is to ramble and walk around when I'm speaking, and I'm going to feel slightly constrained as I do this. But it's not going to be all on my side. Part of what I'm going to do is, since I feel somewhat disconcerted by these, my job is to try and make you feel disconcerted as well. I hope to spend the next half an hour giving you an alternate view of what's happening in the digital world, because I'm surrounded by people who I'm sure who've been part of it, heard everything there's been to hear about the new generation, its challenges, who's playing, what's happening, and to really think that someone else is going to be able to tell you anything of value while between you and the spaghetti that you're going to strangle yourself with isn't really worth trying. So humor me. What you're going to see is an alternative view of what's happening in the digital world. So what I'm actually going to be doing has a background that you need to understand. Some years ago, when I was watching a movie called Short Circuit, must have been 1983 or 84, and a robot in that number 5 came alive because it was shocked. And watching that movie as a young man, it made me realize that robots only have 2 types of input, information and energy. And since then, I've always looked at information with the viewpoint of food. I have actually considered, and I've nearly finished a book on the subject, about looking at everything to do with information overload as if you would speak about food overload. How much of this is a production problem? How much is a consumption problem? What are the implications? Does a person watching a particular news channel for 31 days have the same impact on them as eating McDonald's for 31 days? What does it feel like if you start thinking of information as food? In studying that subject, I began to think, or I had to spend more time understanding how we ate. And what I looked at was realizing that for people who really looked at food carefully, the stomach was a means of digesting food, and cooking was nothing more than an external stomach. So the perspective of anything to do with cooking, once we discovered fire and had cooking implements, was that we had an external stomach. That then led on to thinking of everything to do with technology as a means of either augmenting or accelerating evolution. So if you wore Kevlar or a suit of armor, right, all creatures managed to get protection, the armadillo types, whatever else. But it took generation upon generation to get that. Now with technology, we can achieve the things that evolution would, external to our bodies, in ways that sharply accelerate what evolution would otherwise do. You have spears and guns rather than claws and fangs. So my mindset has been firmly in a world where, while I talk about digital, I think we have moved from a physics age to an age of biology. So the construct you see me place on the digital world is with that bias. What I want to take you through is this framework. If you want to know where I believe the entrepreneurs are leading, where they're going, and what you need to be looking at, then the construct I'm suggesting is that there are actually 4 layers of activity. And as we see each of these layers, there is a bit of William Gibson in it. The future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I want to spend a little time on each of those layers, explaining what is happening so that when we look at where we are today, we have a framework for understanding what's happening rather than random acts of violence. Right? There are obviously some core things that are in common, and I'll come to that at the end, and I still expect to finish within 30 minutes. Let's look at making. The first thing that had to be made, I mean, this is a bit like Big Bang and the creation of the universe, right? There had to be some effort made in order to create what Julie spoke about. Oh, this was earlier during the closed investor session about, an enabling environment. Okay? And the enabling environment, whether you think of the World Wide Web, whether you think of Linux, whether you think of Apache, whether you think of the fiber environment for connectivity, whether you think of the mobile phone changing, whether you think of the way open platforms work with the advent of Android, I've pushed all that together and said all that's happening there is that an environment was being built on which things could happen, okay? I'm asking you guys to follow me in saying all that this group of people over the last 20 years have been doing is building an enabling environment, right? You had to have a web into which things, people, documents, any sensors could actually engage in order to transfer digital data. You had to have an environment where it was possible to have connectivity, and as ubiquitous connectivity as possible, that it had to move off the desktop. In fact, at Salesforce, we bought a company 4 months ago, and one of the shocks when you visit the company is there aren't any desks. Right? How the hell do you figure out what's happened to the desktop when there aren't desks? Right? The office has already morphed into becoming a cross between Starbucks and an airport business lounge. Okay? People are operating at any level. There aren't any cables or wires, but I'm rambling. The truth is, we have spent the best part of, in some people's eyes, 20 years, some people's eyes, 40 years. You could say since Moore's Law, you could say since the dawn of Shannon and the information age, so you could even roll back to maybe the Second World War. But it's a trivial time in humanity's sort of longevity about how this alternate universe is being built. You can call it cyberspace, you can call it the digital infrastructure, but it is actually a very short space of time in our environment. But things are changing fast in that environment because, in the medieval times, moving from saying thee and thou to you took about 60 years. Today, in a space of something like maybe 3 years, a child who would have gone up to a plasma screen and done that would have got mommy saying something like, darling, don't do that, that's somebody else's television, you're putting your paw prints on. Today, in 3 years, you realize that child is expecting the TV to talk back, right? Touch is here to stay, right? And I'm already facing the other side of it, I keep hitting devices that are not touch, expecting them to respond because it's become part of my natural expectation now. And by the time I get used to it, voice will probably be the activation mechanism as a further adjunct. But this is actually where we are today, right? Accept and believe that there is an infrastructure that is only 20 years old in conservative eyes, and you could argue it's twice that, but that's all. But actually, it doesn't end there. The making is not a phase that stops, it carries on. Right? This is a very simple object, but I love the object. It's a plastic case into which you can put a 3A battery to make it a C. Okay? Saying the battery itself does not change, it's only the form factor that changes. So you could have at home a few plastic boxes or sleeves so that whatever battery you need, you're able to migrate, as long as you've got the smallest one. Trying to get a C to look like a AAA is going to be a little hard with that sleeve. But that's not what's fascinating about this. That object was printed, okay? That was printed on a 3D printer. Part of what we're going to be making to connect up to this digital environment is the ability to transfer things electronically from place A to place B and reproduce them, not as a fax machine reproduced an image or a telegram reproduced sound or text, but the object itself being reproduced. So the digital environment we're entering is already one where for the last 10, 12 years, we've had commercially available 3D printers. Okay? A big shift, but one that we have just begun. When you build an environment, and you can say Big Bang was N billion years ago, but man's been around for 200,000-300,000 years. We reached a stage within that time when we started the job of cartography. I've been fascinated by looking at the maps and how people imagined the world to be once they realized it was round. Getting used to why American Indians are even called Indians, right? Because that's where people thought they'd reached, India. But the facts of the matter are, whenever you have a new world, before that world becomes useful, a lot of time has to be spent by people charting that world. And that charting of the world goes through a whole pile of work. Okay? Obviously, someone's figuring out what's where and indexing it and spidering it. That's just the Martha Graham sort of day for Google. But work needed to be done in order to start saying, at least let's find out where all the documents are. Okay? Let's see what this web is. But it's as if the web is just digital means document, which is crazy. Neither is it fair to say, today one of the things I tried to check on, because this is a site that's going through the cartography of something else. It looks through the world and only ties, for a retarded hippie like me, the location where album photographs, 60s and early 70s record album photographs were taken, and connecting them to the map. And this is actually the nearest to this hotel right now. The rock stars didn't do very much around, Dogsmasfield. But there's someone doing this, but you could say this is trivial. JP, don't waste my time. We've got lunch to go to. Why talk about being able to find out where an album cover photograph was taken? This is actually a lot more interesting. Someone has gone through the effort of mapping the universe when it comes to leaves. And if you imagine the kind of Linnaean classification systems or the people who classified books like the Dewey Decimal System or whatever else, there's a lot of work to be done in the cartography of objects, as it were. Right? So people have come along and said, we will photograph every leaf that exists, and we will document the leaf, the plant, the fruit. But the joy of that is not that I can just look at it, but more importantly, now I can take a photograph of a leaf and get back an answer of what that leaf is. Okay? Now that starts getting really interesting to me, because the automatic feedback loop, now there is an overlay. There's another universe along this enablement environment to say all the leaves in the world are known. Right? 3 years ago, I wrote about saying I can do a Shazam with songs. I can get a 10-second sample of any song playing, and within 30 seconds get a text message back telling me what was the song, what was the artist. And more recently, I can fulfill that by saying, do I want to listen to it or do I want to buy it? Okay? That sort of digital infrastructure where you're saying everything exists on a plane because you have ubiquity, because you have the devices, because you have the connectivity, and because someone has bothered to do the work of this documentation, of this cartography, of this mapping. The mashing, the mixing, the mutating doesn't happen unless the core is actually formed. There are people doing this. This only covers North American species at present. But the important thing for you to take away is that there are people investing in this, building it, serving it. Right? This is one of the better-selling apps going around. But maybe you're not into leaves. Right? Now this is somewhat, this hurts you where it really hurts, the stomach. Right? Someone else has come up with an app that says, take a photograph of what you're eating, and I will tell you how many calories you're about to consume. Okay? Probably there's a nice and there's an ugly version of this, right? One that tells you what you want to hear, and the other that tells you what the truth is. Right? Obviously, it's not perfect, but what actually happens is that's where the power of everyone being connected comes in. You can immediately click on and say, this was wrong, these are the reasons it was wrong, and you correct it. So there's a crowdsourcing, Linus's law, that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. The act of this form of cartography, the more people you expose it to, okay? And it's a big, big deal, this sort of crowdsourced mapping. Right? We had the tragedy of Steve Fawcett going missing and then being killed, in an air accident. And the worldwide digital community was encouraged to say, help us find him. What actually happened through the crowdsourcing of satellite images was over 170 planes that had not been found were found. They just weren't his. Okay? But out of the tragedy came some level of good because people could map the precise location of over 170 planes that have been known to have crashed over the years because you had the ability to apply human intelligence. So what you're beginning to see is that people with a second life do have a first life, okay? That the digital world is now getting augmented into the physical world in ways that are actually useful and valuable by the time you see it through. Okay? It changes business models as well. So this is not just an altruistic way, right? The Rolling Stones were one of the first bands to start saying, wow, if we have this augmented reality model where you're taking something physical and real and augmenting it with something digital provided and tied together by the location, the presence, the map, what else could we do? So Exile on Main Street becomes Exile on your street. You can start ordering posters to do with the band, buy music, whatever else related to you. That mass customization effects are being had. But actually, I didn't put this up because I'm a fan of the Rolling Stones. I'm actually more of a fan of the Grateful Dead. But I put it up because of this concept called layer. Okay? There's a fabulous company out there which is, again, part of an enabling environment. And all they say is, we will create a thin layer over your operating environment to allow you to attach digital objects which can then get viewed as an overlay. So when I come out of a London tube station, I can look at the environment and get my map physically overlaid on what I'm actually seeing so that I'm not going through the 360 turn of the analog paper to try and figure out how to orient myself. Now, if you imagine going into a museum and not having to stare at the notices because there aren't any notices. You can now look at something and be told what it is, not through the pain of visual signs that are physically put out there, but through a logical layer that goes into your viewing device. Imagine going to a garden, right, or a set of gardens and not having to look at notices, things stuck in the ground, because all these things in a way detract from the natural view. And there's a maintenance cost, there's an update cost. You have to keep changing these things if you change the exhibits. When you do it with this kind of overlay mentality, then you're understanding what a map, mash, mix-up of the digital environment means. And it's there in everything, right? Maybe, for all I know, with what Martin was talking about with healthcare, we would get to the point where the aggregation of data about the patient comes through by saying it's an overlay as the doctor is looking at the patient. There are no risks for either the analog things being left in the wrong place or tagged or looked at upside down or anything else, because once you have this power of being able to have the digital infrastructure and location, right, all our mashups started only when people understood the value of maps. Okay? As soon as you could put that location context, life changed. But life changed differently, because if you imagine people like ants, okay, they used to communicate, using pheromone trails, etc. But the idea of that was there was only one trail. We have much more than that, because when you saw ants walking around, what an ant would do is you see an ant going around trying to look for food. They scurry around as if, mad as a bag of spiders, and then suddenly they seem to harmonize and all follow. Right? That's because they keep going 2 new routes. And as soon as they find one that works to food, they follow the route, they went back. Now that route's sort of twofold. Somebody else sees a twofold loop and says, I want to follow that. Suddenly it becomes 3, 4, 5. So the adoption of that single trail starts signaling to the rest of the ants, follow this one. Now we can't see it. But the idea behind that is that you layer something which is invisible, providing information to take you somewhere. But we have an advantage compared to the natural world of the ants. We can also layer this in time. So one of my favorite guys, a guy called Chris Wilde, he came up with this idea of wanting to be a retronaut. He would allow you to move in time while in the same physical space. So a few years ago when I met him, it was at TED, he showed me what I was seeing and then showed me what that same view would look like as he passed through different years. So building a construct where you could take the digital object and file it away in such a way that you could say, I'm going to stay in this street and walk up and down in time, or I'm going to stay in this time and walk up and down in this street. Both work. Because we can have this layering of time. We can expose ourselves to different time periods. Right? This, again, is some of the power that we have. And by the way, none of this is future. This is today. These are companies that exist today, but each layer, as I'm saying, the making side has just got to 20 years. The mapping, the mixing, the mashing. When you start seeing why in heaven would people check in on places using a Foursquare or a GoWalla or a Facebook Places, what a waste of time. Don't they have something better to do? But actually, they are doing something very valuable while doing that. They're associating GPS points with information about what that GPS point is in a digital world. Okay? So now when I came in this morning, I could check in, and someone some years ago had already established this location as the Four Seasons Hotel, Dogmas Field, etc., and even separated the spa area and the conference area from the main area of the hotel. Okay? This is part of what is happening today in the digital world. The building out is leading to a cartography, which is almost a second layer of enabling. Because you can only then build things on top of that, location-based services, etc., don't actually exist until the location exists, and the location needs to exist in a digital context which is married to the physical context. And that marrying is going on. And whenever you see errors, again, that's crowdsourced. Billions of people being able to say, by the way, you were 3 inches off on this, or 3 miles off on this, depending on which particular screen you were looking at and what you were measuring. But the point is the same. Right? We are going through layer after layer of evolution of alternate worlds which are expressing the physical world in a digital space, creating digital objects in that, and then marrying the two together. But even that isn't enough. Because once you have set this cartography up, once you know you have the maps and you've got the birds and the bees and the flowers and the plants and the wine bottles and the books and whatever else classified, because everything that can be classified will be classified and associated. Its movement will be sort of trackable, because that is the world we're leading to. And there are entrepreneurs investing their time and their effort, knowing that they're creating a new form of gold, a new form of oil, which is the metadata that will be needed to associate with the digital objects that people will use. Right? Throughout history, society has been about what I guess in the 19th century used to be called talking points or points of interest. Conversation takes place between people because they start building on what they have in common, and then they use the bridges that they built in order to cope with their differences or to learn from their differences. So why you go into work 30 years ago and you spoke about yesterday's football match or yesterday's meal or with restaurant or yesterday's TV show or the book you were reading or whatever else, is that those form the social objects that allow you to engage, get to a level of comfort, And then once you've had that engagement, you're able to deal with the differences that you have. And most differences are how you learn. And nobody learns from sameness. So the role of the social object in being able to build society is also got to be understood in this, and one of those elements is the metadata. But there are many other aspects to this because there's, I'm just giving you one example as Empire Avenue, but there are millions, or, well, a few hundred anyway, and I'm acutely aware about 4 or 5 that I use extensively, that are now in the business of shifting gear altogether and saying, we have the infrastructure, and it's still evolving, but the core infrastructure exists. We have the catalogs, the maps, the indices, the creation of the objects, and we will still find more and more classes of object to classify, but the Linnaean naming is no longer about just flora and fauna. It's about places, it's about people, it's about things, it's about time, events. Everything is being classified because we now have the time dimension to cope with as well. But above that, now comes people who say, let me understand how we're going to value the people and the things and the events. And to do that, you need to be able to create metrics. You need to be able to create analytics. And these are non-trivial as well, because one of the ways we look at the world we live in today is that for the last 400 or 500 years, business has been characterized as hierarchies of products and customers. And if you look at the accounting systems we use, designed at least 600 years ago, that's pretty much all it does. Because what's implied within what we see are static views of values placed around revenues and costs and an understanding of them, largely to do with saying it's customer or it's product or service. What's happening now is that the world we're moving into is much more a network of relationships and capabilities. And for a long time, we've been talking about human capital or social capital, but been singularly unwilling to either invest in or work through what it means to value relationships or to value human capital. Okay? And this is getting very, very important right now. So while 90% of the world floats around, there are actually pioneers out there saying, how do I calculate the worth of a network? How do I understand the size of the network a person has and the participant quality within that? How do I find out who the tastemakers are in an environment? Because when they blog something, when they tweet something, when they link to something, things happen. Because these are no longer the realm of sampling or of about some sort of aggregation of stuff where you have no idea what the sample size was. Today, you can get this information about everything and everybody. It's like saying, all of you would have been aware for years that something like Sky Television is able to tell you how many seconds you watch something before you turn channel and whether you watched the ad or not, or at least whether the ad was visible on the screen. They can't necessarily tell whether you were physically there. But the point I'm trying to make within that is we now live in a time where it's become more and more important to value relationships and to value capabilities, but we don't have the tools to do that. But there are pioneers there doing it. So a firm like Clout does this for Twitter, right? If you go to LinkedIn, you get a value for reputation overall. If you go to an Amazon or an eBay, you're getting a value for an individual act or event. Did you find this review useful? How many stars? Or how good a payer were you? How good a buyer were you? How good a seller were you? So there are companies today collecting rich data about interactions and putting that together in order to form an environment where the new world of being able to value relationships and the capability are being formed. So now you have this world where it says, okay, you have an infrastructure that's enabling, but it's not complete. But it's largely good to go for the kind of things we're doing in our first generation. We have a layer on top where people are mapping, classifying, augmenting data to it, creating groups, and being able to provide even further enabling tools to allow you to overlay those classifications on what you see, feel, and touch. Okay? That's the second zone. That is now getting serious, but not yet got there. You have a third layer of people who are turning around and saying, find out what these things are worth. Start seeing frequency of people going in. And remember, all these elements of data include things that used to be, I mean, I'm going to take an aside for a second. Right? How many of you were around when film was analog and you actually had to go get your film developed, choose what you wanted printing, a multi-pass system with analog film? Put your hand up. Okay, this is not normal for the kind of places I normally talk at, but I guess I asked that on purpose. But the reason I brought that up is that within the short space of maybe 30 years, the analog two-pass film, which suddenly became something you could try to set a date and time on if your fingers were like toothpicks. So most of the devices in the late 80s that you could try, you left it to whatever the shop set it at because it was too much trouble to set a date and time. Then they gave you a way to tag it, which looked like the way, for me, you gave your name on a video game. Again, most things were tagged AAB because you failed to master the stupid engagement that they had as to how you're going to write some 3-character notification for it. But today, you take a photograph with a smartphone and upload it to Flickr, and you actually see how much free metadata, very cheap metadata, you have passed with it, right? It's auto date stamped, auto time stamped, geolocated, the device, the focal length is known, environment conditions are there. You are able to tag it, and if you use an environment like Flickr, others are able to add to that tagging, okay? A very, very rich world. So this metadata, I mean, at a level of abstraction, whether you look at Amazon or Google or eBay or Flickr or even Facebook, you find that the value they generate is the value you generate, right? They are just vehicles for abstracting value from customers, retaining that value and playing it back. Anybody can build a new auction house, but can't build 200 million ratings overnight. Anyone can build a new bookstore, but can't get 9 million reviews overnight. The so-called user-generated data is where the value lies. Anyone can build another search engine, but not get the depth of trend analysis that you would get because people use that. Adoption is one piece, but every one of us leaves valuable information based on our place, our time, our preferences, our activity, everywhere. And however big brotherly it sounds, we have to decide whether we live in a world of privacy as a scarcity, or whether we've moved into an information abundance that makes a lot of this possible, okay? There is an economics of abundance model that comes along. When you see the new generation, right, my favorite definition of a teenager is someone who can send a text message without taking their hand out of their pocket, okay? They live in a different world. But one thing is true, their concept of sharing, they rent things, they don't need to own things. They will use Zipcar, they will download, they will stream their movies. They will be willing to share in ways that we may have thought we wanted to. And then somewhere along my sort of, my retarded hippie lines, I found I started collecting clutter. I wish I knew when it happened, but it happened. For my children, it ain't happening, okay? They are born, they're all born since 1982, and they have different views. They have different values. And that's where we're really heading. So I then want to come to where all this is heading, okay? Because throughout history, people have been talking about wanting to find meaning. And when I'm dealing with an investor conference to do with entrepreneurs, then I guess some of that meaning is, where's the money, right? It's great to hear about this kind of infrastructure, but why would this mean anything to me? And I just want to point out a few things in that context. When you, how many of you are acutely familiar with Groupon? Okay. How many of you are acutely familiar with Foursquare? Okay. How about Spotify? Okay. What do you think the age of the CEO of all those three was when they founded it? Okay. Shall we say, not on Martin's upper end of your Western health and longevity expectations. Okay? The reason I want to bring them out is those guys appear to have been born wired to think differently about the digital space, while the digital immigrant wants to believe that these are people who live in dark corners and communicate with each other only using electronic means, don't actually have a life. All the formal evidence, especially those collected by the Pew Institute, suggests that the new generations are super communicators compared to the older generations. They augment their interactions in analog terms with their interactions in digital terms. They reduce, one of the terms, because of pedophilia, I'm not meant to use the term, but I don't care, but they reduce grooming costs, okay? When you use something like a Facebook, you do away with the time of, hello, how are you, and has your aunt's dog healed from that fall and whatever else, right? Happy birthday is sort of assumed. How was your holiday, etc. is assumed. So a lot of the so-called social object conversation that's sort of making good, trying to just create a social exchange, is done in the social network electronically. So when you meet, you can actually engage on something more valuable than the small talk. And that's what these people are doing. So they build companies faster, they network better, but they have a different perspective of what this infrastructure is like. For them, the digital world is one where they have an infrastructure that somebody else gave to them. We may be taking things from them, as Mark was telling us, further generations, but we've also given some things to these further generations, like how the internet has evolved into the post-World Wide Web, post-PC environment. And there are people, which is sort of the final part of this conversation. None of this is meaningful or would happen except for understanding that we live primarily in a knowledge worker world, okay? Knowledge work, sadly, isn't flat line, okay? It's lumpy. We have peaks of knowledge work and troughs. Our generation, or at least my generation, has chosen to deal with that problem badly. The idea is we cannot possibly tell people we don't have any work to do, so we fill the trough with something called meetings, okay? Now, you're busy, and when real work comes to take you up, you have to work longer than the day that you were given. So now you're working really hard, and it's, but it all starts with this inability to accept that knowledge work is lumpy. Why is that important to me? Why is it important in a digital age? Because the way you deal with lumpy work when you're in other non-knowledge work constructs, like a fireman or any form of emergency services, an ambulance, even a policeman, etc., is you give those people foreground and background tasks so that there is one task to do when you're on call for an emergency, a doctor, right? And there is another that you can do to get over the fact that it's not panic stations. Well, that same thing is true for all knowledge work because it's non-linear, right? We've reached an age where we've built or convinced ourselves there are processes that are repeatable. Sadly, they're not, because we've gone to such a level of mass customization for most of the services we provide that actually we spend more time dealing with the exception than we deal with the rule, which means we have to get to better pattern analysis, saying, I've seen this movie before, I know how that book ends. Then we are going to deal with trying to put the square peg of what's actually happening into the round hole of the historically designed and archaic process. These are the ways this sort of consumerized thinking is entering the enterprise, that we now need to tag what we do at work differently. We need to be able to associate what we're doing with the locations. We need to have an understanding of the digital content that we're exchanging and working with. Some people get their rocks off talking over a PowerPoint demonstration or an Excel spreadsheet, okay? We have to forgive such people. But in this kind of context, how we live in this world has to provide an environment where what Clay Shirky called the cognitive surplus, the fact that people have that free time, can be usefully employed for the person, for the company, for society. Wikipedia would not exist except for the existence of cognitive surplus. There are many, many things we do. When Martin again was talking about healthcare, I'm turning around and saying, well, the errors that exist in those cases, right? If they were sufficiently, we have privacy laws that come in the way of being able to look at a lot of things, but we also have huge gains that can be made if we learn to only make private that which is worth making private, rather than shutting everything down, right? Because we have this conflict of saying everyone wants to be private, and everyone thinks collaboration is really important. Many of the problems we face today as individuals, as countries, as society, as the world, require collaboration to take place, and it can't take place unless we do three things. We switch from thinking about an environment of scarcity-based economics to one of abundance-based, right? We move from an idea that we live in an analog world or a digital world to know that we live in the hybrid. And then in that hybrid, I hope I've tried to give you some framework for looking at it differently. And the third element is, when we do that, we understand that there is a collective that can operate, which means that the privacy and confidentiality versus collaboration sort of spectrum needs to be managed carefully. The good news is there are a whole pile of people, youngsters, building companies, actually pulling, getting your investments into those companies, growing dramatically and transforming the world, giving me all the optimism I want, as a balance to Mark. And I don't mean that. I'm an economist by profession, which is sad, but these things happen. But the promise of this digital world is immense. The reason why this promise is immense is because it's actually not an isolation, it's an augment. The generations that are coming are already trained to use that world. The tools are improving. The infrastructure is still being played out. But, and I'm going to stop there, I hope I've given you an alternate view as to what's actually happening in the digital space.